The 4 decades of rock on 106.1 Rock Radio. All this week, the 70s, prog, punk and power cuts. Today, life.
At this time, the 70s, there's probably the biggest divide between the sort of even rock music, never mind just music.
Yeah, it was really
but the kind of rock music that people in North America are making and listening to. Because, of course, we've got the rise of country rock and of FM-friendly, the Eagles, Leonard Skinner in the States. Very different to the sort of avant-garde, Roxy Music, Pink Floyd, Genesis, stuff that's been done in the UK. Why was that?
Well, at this time, pop music is really starting to fragment, and this is driven by a lot of things, not only regional and local differences, but also by the interests of the labels and record companies and radio stations. Among the changes were things like the singer-songwriter movement, which began right at the end of the 60s. But this pretty much originally was in the Laurel Canyon area of California, and a number of them had been in the folk music, but who, with the appearance of Dylan and Beatles, the Beatles got into pop music. But later they went back to their kind of folksy country roots. And Graham Parsons, for example, a big influence, the Byrds, bands like Buffalo Springfield, they were introducing this kind of more countrified sound, and singer-songwriters kind of were involved in that to a certain extent.
Do they lay the foundations for what presumably Bruce Springsteen would do?
I think you could say that. He's kind of rock style, but with that kind of singer-songwriter mentality, the idea that it's music is about authentic experiences, there's a certain psychological and emotional truth to it. It's not just a pop song. So that's happening on one part of the country. And as you mentioned, there's the southern rock stuff, bands like ZZ Top, Leonard Skinner, Marshall Tucker Band, and these bands are really kind of playing up a southern identity, southern United States identity. Neil Young warned us against that in his song Southern Man.
And later embraced it wholeheartedly, did he not?
Yeah.
Well, didn't they make up eventually, Skinner and Neil Young?
Did they? I don't know. I mean, there's another idol smashed then, if that's the case. But then the other types of music, like soul music, was going strong, and Motown, in a sense, kind of lent its sound to emergent disco, and disco came out in the 70s, and that marked a real split.
At that time in the early 70s, you've got incredible rock music being made by black artists like Stevie Wonder, like Marvin Gaye, like Isaac Hayes.
Absolutely.
With Hot Buttered Soul is a rock album made by a black man. But then we have this incredible divide between rock music and disco music.
Yeah.
It's almost like the two are torn apart just at the time that they were coming together.
Marvin Gaye's What's Going On was really one of the first out of Motown that really signaled a consciousness of what was going on.
What's going on?
Just the title, What's Going On, could be read in so many different ways by the fans. But you're right, I think a lot of people nowadays have trouble getting their heads around the fact that there was this big split between those who followed rock music and those who listened to disco music.
Was there ever a movement in music that reflected the times and the politics of the times? Punk rock. I mean, it came along, it was an enormously depressing time to be English, to be young and to be English. Progressive rock had disappeared down a very, very strange cul-de-sac from which it would eventually have to do some sort of three-point turn and eventually make its way back. But punk rock reflected the spirit in the lyrics, in the look, in the anger and the passion of punk rock. It was all about 1976, wasn't it? The spirit of 76.
Yeah, that's right. Punk came out of nowhere, didn't it? And it did reflect this kind of disillusion. But, you know, another thing that maybe had an influence on punk was the film A Clockwork Orange. Because it was a kind of a future dystopia, and it was young kids, but the violence of it and the kind of nihilism of it and just the anguish of it, this was so far removed from that kind of 60s ideal, but I think that spoke to the punk rock generation.
The book written by Anthony Burgess, Of This Parish, one of the most prominent Mancunians of the 20th century, and lots of the bands that came out of Manchester at that time, Joy Division, Buzzcocks, Slaughter and the Dogs.
Oh, that's right. The performance of June 4, 1976, when the Sex Pistols played here at the Lesser Free Trade Hall.
You got that right.
That was a major event. It was one of these things that a lot of people claim to have been at, but in fact it was just a handful of people showed up for the concert. But that was a turning point, certainly in Manchester mythology, but probably realistically in the music that came out of here, and inspired a lot of bands that gave us that sound that we associate with this place.
But of course it couldn't last. And it shouldn't last, punk rock, should it? The whole point of it partly was that it would eventually sort of collapse in on itself. People weren't supposed to have a career in punk rock.
Yeah, that's one of these ironies about pop music, because the youth movement does dissipate, but the styles linger on. And even now you have bands that call themselves punks and things, but it has changed drastically from what it was. That kind of nihilistic, anarchistic attitude that was just so raw and angry, that couldn't have lasted. That had to burn itself out. But the fashions remain. Things that appear on the periphery get sucked into the core and they become the mainstream. I can remember when these mohawk haircuts and the torn t-shirts actually kind of terrified people to see. And you'd see some punks on one side of the road and you'd probably go to the other side of the road to get away from them because you might get gobbed on or you might get
exactly.
attacked.
I mean, I was living in my own native Bury, which at the time was very much an industrial town in the paper-making business. You couldn't walk the streets of somewhere like Bury dressed as a punk rocker. You would get your head kicked in. It was you couldn't. It was too shocking for people to deal with.
But nowadays, it's quite common. Just the most conventional people sport mohawk haircuts
and tattoos. It's
yes.
become commonplace for people to. When once upon a time, it was shocking.
That's right. So I think what happens is the signs and symbols that the young people adopt eventually become the mainstream taste, and then the young people look somewhere else.
You stir my natural emotions. You make me feel under the hood, and I'm hurt. And if I start a commotion, I run the risk of losing you, and that's worse. Ever fall in love with someone? Ever fallen in love with someone? Ever fallen in love with someone you should have fallen in love with? I can't see much of the future unless we find out what's to blame. What a shame.